Well, good afternoon. My name is Stephen Sheffrin. I'm the Executive Director of the Murphy Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today for the Yates Lecture. The Mary C. Parker Yates Lecture was endowed in 1996 by Murphy Institute alumna Rebecca Yates Vielander in memory of her mother. It is designed to promote university-wide discussion of issues of current concern and to bring leading thinkers to the Tulane campus. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Giovanni Peri, one of the country's leading experts on the economic effects of immigration. His research is focused on the impact of migration and immigration on labor markets, and especially on the effects of productivity and wages. Giovanni Peri is a professor and chair of the Department of Economics at UC Davis and research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He originally studied in Bocconi in Milan and earned his PhD at UC Berkeley. He's editor of the Regional Science and Urban Economics Journal and on the editorial board of many other journals as well, and he's widely published in the very top journals. In fact, about a week ago, I got a little email from the American Economic Association announcing the table of contents of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, a journal that's assigned in all the undergraduate classes, and lo and behold, the lead article there was by Professor Peri. His research has been featured in popular blogs and media outlets, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the Washington Post. He's also received major grants for his research from the NSF, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the World Bank, and the Volkswagen Foundation. But for me, this is a particularly special occasion. I helped hire Professor Peri onto the faculty at UC Davis, and then had the great pleasure in the dean's office of seeing his career blossom over the years and turning into one of UC Davis's star faculty. And best of all, from UC Davis's point of view, he found the environment stimulating, challenging, and friendly, and is now providing leadership to the institution. Obviously, the election has raised the stakes in immigration policy. Now more than ever, we need to have a balanced and clear discussion of all aspects of immigration. And today we have this perfect speaker to do so. After today's lecture, we'll have time for questions and answers, and then a reception next door, open to all of you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Giovanni Peri.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me here. Yes, I still remember our first meeting in the dean's office. I was kind of terrified by Steve back then when I knew that he might have hired me. But since then, it has been a great time in Davis, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here today to talk to you guys about immigration. So yes, it would be impossible not to connect this a little bit to the election that we just had. But today, I really want to start there to go somewhere else, to bring you where an economist can do his best job, which is among facts and among, I think, solid ideas that we have developed. So let me start with a little bit with acknowledging one important fact. So immigration has a long history in the United States, and the controversy around immigration is just as long. Immigration has been a very controversial topic and policy theme since the late 1800s, when the first large mass immigration happened. So this is, of course, a little vignette making fun of Chinese immigrants. This is Uncle Sam looking at all the European, the mafia micronationals here coming to the country in 1900. This is a little pamphlet that try to keep Japanese outside of our school. And this is our president-elect saying that he will build a wall with Mexico. At the same time, immigration also has stirred a lot of strong support in immigration in the United States. A lot of people associate the Statue of Liberty to the symbol of a European that come to the US to have a new start, a new beginning. And many prominent people wrote books and wrote important pieces about the US being a nation of immigrants. This is a famous book by John Kennedy. This is a recent bestseller about the US being a nation of nations. So, of course, there is a strong sentiment around immigration, but today I will limit myself to make the economic case for immigration. So in large part, today I will talk about facts And I will talk about simple, maybe very simple framework and models. They're not models. We are a way in which we think about migration. And first I will revisit a couple of facts that we have seen on the newspaper, but I will put them in perspective. Then I will give you a little bit of the global and national trends to emphasize that immigration is really an important and long-term force which is with us and is going to be with us and is going to affect a lot of our economy. And then I will talk about immigration in the US and its impact. It's useful to separate what economists call immigration of low-skilled or less skilled and educated and college-skilled and educated. And then, of course, I will conclude with some challenges which are ahead and some policy ideas which I think are important to keep in mind. So let me point at a couple of particularly controversial points of immigration and some headlines put in perspective. So the first is a lot of attention has been pointed in the United States in the campaign to the relationship between US and Mexico, so immigrant from Mexico, and on unlawful immigrant, undocumented immigrants. In particular, there is some pieces have raised the issue that they are costly for our country. They pose as fiscal costs. They are transferred. They need services. They don't pay for them, and so they're costly. Let me put this a little bit in perspective. So it's certainly true that there is a large number of undocumented immigrants in the US. And in fact, the number as of 2015 is estimated to be around 11 million. But that number has not been growing for at least a decade. So essentially, there is no net migration of undocumented between Mexico and the United States. There has been no net migration for the last 10 years. In fact, the period of large undocumented migration were the 90s. So a lot of the emphasis of new people coming in is something that belongs to the 90s and in the early 2000s. After the recession, from the post-recession 2009 on, this has been flat. Not only the net number has been relatively stable, but the immigrant in general from Mexico, immigration has been plummeting down. In fact, while, as I said, in the late 90s, early 2000s, Mexico was the largest country of immigration in the United States, the flow of Mexicans to the US has declined dramatically. In the last 3 years, 2013, 14, 15 and 16, Mexico is not even the largest country in terms of the number of immigrants that come to our country. China is, and second is India, and now Mexico, the Philippines are close fourth. If you look at net immigration from Mexico, so people who come minus people who go back, actually in the last decade has seen negative numbers. So there are more Mexicans who are going back voluntarily or involuntarily to Mexico than Mexicans that are coming. So I would say from these three things, the first thing that should come from facts is that immigration is important, but immigration between US and Mexico right now is more a problem of stock that flows in non-economic jargon. Is more a problem of how many are here and what is going to happen to the undocumented than how many are coming. Why is immigration from Mexico declined so much and essentially is almost disappearing? Many reasons. It started with the big recession that destroyed a lot of the jobs where Mexicans went in construction, in manufacturing. But also Mexico has undergone a massive demographic transition. The new generation of Mexican is much smaller than the generation that hit the labor market in the 90s. Now, fertility rate in Mexico is below 2. It's close, to replacement, around 2 children per mom. 30 years ago, it was 5. So the population of Mexico is shrinking, and the young cohort, young people migrate, older people don't, is becoming much smaller, and that's why. And of course, there is border security. There is not a wall, but there is a very strong fence and a lot of drones. It's very hard to cross the border already right now. So if we are to be serious about the problem with Mexico going on, I don't think that the wall is really what we should be discussing. What should be discussing, and I will, is what is going to happen with the 11 million undocumented. Are they a big cost to the United States? Well, there is an interesting thing of the undocumented Mexican immigrant, which is that they overwhelmingly work. So if you look at people who are adult and don't have a high school degree, so clearly that group of immigration from Mexico is quite shifted towards the low end of the education spectrum. A lot of immigrants from Mexico do not have high school degree. But among those, so given that they are going to take a certain type of job, what we call unskilled job, among those, a very large percentage of them really work. If you compare this group, adult with no high school degree, and you look at what's the employment rate of Mexican immigrants and of natives, you see that about 70% of Mexican work, while only 33-34% of American don't work. And about 70% of the income from that group comes from wages, while only about 30% of the income of Americans come from wages. So what do the other Americans do? A lot of them receive many more transfer through welfare. They're much more dependent on food stamps, on TAMF, on Social Security transfer, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, while this group of immigrants much less. Some of them don't qualify. The undocumented don't qualify for those type of transfer. So the immigration of Mexicans, even at the very low end of the spectrum, is not generating large fiscal transfer in the sense that the welfare state is giving them a lot, but it's clearly an immigration for labor purposes. These people come to the United States because they want to work. So those two titles that I put at the beginning, build a wall and there is a crisis because there is a large cost, both of them looking at these numbers don't look like the real issues here. The real issues is that we have a stock of immigrants who are already here, who mostly work, who in large part contribute. They don't have access to welfare, but many of them pay taxes through this fake Social Security number, and so we need to figure out what is a reasonable solution going on for those undocumented. If I was to give this, so this issue of immigration is not an issue of the United States only. I will show in a second that the global trends are very similar for US and other countries. But if I was talking to Europeans right now, what is on top of their heads is not the undocumented, are the refugees. So Europe is undergoing a similar crisis of identity, I would say, but about the refugees. And the title are biggest refugee waves ever in Europe. 60 million people displaced as never before, and Europe buckles under this big inflow. And 100% true, the cases are dramatic, the images are very heart-touching, very touching. And I was talking today with one of your classmates who went and worked in a refugee camp in Greece in the summer, and yes, it's kind of tough. But even this needs to be put a little bit in perspective. Refugees, as important as they are and in need of attention, they are a very, very small part of the total migrants. So if we do an immigration policy reform, we need to consider refugee, but we need to make an immigration policy that works for the others. So this is, if you take total migrants in the world, so they're about 10% of total migrant refugee. If you take migrant across country border, there are about 250 million people in the world who are migrants, who live in a country which is not where they were born, and there are only about 15 million of refugees. The 60 million of refugees that that title referred to includes internally displaced people. Most of the refugees are refugees in their own country. If you look at Syria now, 8 million Syrians are displaced within Syria. Then there are 3 million between Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. And then 1 million made it to Europe. That 1 million has made Europe just go in hyperventilation. But the point is that this is a crisis which has gone on for 5 years. The war has been going for 8 years, and most of the refugees are not in Europe. So when we talk about this, it's important to put this in perspective. We need to think about all the migrants, a large part of which are not refugees. One fact that you don't hear very much is that if I have to base the immigration policy of the US as of today, the biggest group that is growing, is becoming the most important, and it has a very uncertain future, is this group that you never hear really talk too much about in the news. College educated, especially scientists and engineers, are the largest inflow of foreign-born that is happening in the US right now. So let me show. The visa category which has grown by far the most is the H-1B, which brings in professional specialists, highly educated. It increased by more than 60% in the last 5 years. But even more than this, the real group that is growing are students, college students. American colleges are attracting a number of foreign students, which is just unprecedented. And as I will argue, this is an amazing opportunity and an amazingly interesting potential asset. F1 visa have doubled in the last 5 years, and I'm sure you see it here in my university at UC Davis. Every time I enter a class, I can see with my, sometime after the elections, actually I asked how many were foreign born, and about 30% of my undergrad class, my grad class is all foreign born almost, but my undergrad class is at least 30%. So this is an important flow, that if we're planning and thinking how many immigrants we want, what should they do, we should focus a lot on this group. This group is growing and is very important. In the longer run, and I will come back to this, but I want to emphasize how in the longer run, in the last 30 years, immigrants, foreign-born, have really provided the growth of science and technology, scientists, engineer and technology specialists in the US. The US technology and science is at the leadership of the world, and I will argue not in minor part because the US has been able to attract brilliant minds from all over the world. These are the college-educated STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math workers as a percentage of total employment from 1980 to 2010. And they're a small percentage of the total, right? The scientists and engineers are 2-3% of the total population, but they're a very important part. They are responsible for innovation, technology upgrade, adoption. And while in 1980, only 1 in 10 of them was foreign-born, the blue part, in 2010, 1 in 4 of them it is. And if you look at the growth, all the growth is because of the blue growth. Since 1990, when the H-1B visa program was started, and most of these people came in as an H-1B, the increase in scientists and engineers as a percentage of the American labor force is almost exclusively due to new foreign-born. So again, as I said, if I were to start a conversation with a new Homeland Security or president and trying to point at what are the important part of immigration facts, I would say that certainly the immigration of highly educated, a lot of them are Asian. China and India, the two countries that I showed in the graph, have grown a lot mainly because of being in this group. In terms of flow, essentially, with Mexico, it's about 10 years that there has been no net inflow of undocumented Mexican. And certainly we need to discuss and talk about the undocumented who are here, but maybe the wall is not the best investment we can do. And refugees are a very important part because they are vulnerable, because they carry a lot of humanitarian issues with them, but they are a very small part of the refugee, 10% of the total. In the US, there has been a lot of discussion of Syrian refugees. We are discussing about 55,000 Syrian refugees at most, which is a drop in the bucket. There are about 1.5 million immigrants every year coming in, and there are 8 million of Syrians. So when you read the news, put them in a frame, and let's focus on that. The second thing is, let me talk a little bit about global trends. Immigration is not a thing of the United States. It's not even a thing of Europe. Right now, one big fact of the industrialized world is that immigration has been growing. And I'm going to say 3 facts about this with 3 graphs. First, immigration has been growing roughly at the same rate in the big industrialized part of the world, except Japan. Sorry, I'm keeping Japan out, not only because the data sometimes are a little harder. Japan has had the toughest and more restrictive immigration policies of all rich countries. There are around 1-2% of immigrants in Japan. But Canada and Australia, United States and Europe, this is the percentage of foreign-born in their population. Since the 1960s, if you take the very big picture, they have all had a roughly similarly sloped upward trend, so that now immigrants in the United States and Europe are about 13-14% of the population, and in Canada and Australia are about 25-26% of the population. Now, the timing is a little different. In the United States, if you look carefully, carefully, the really years of fast migration growth are the 90s. The 90s was the period of fastest growth, and then it slowed down in the 2000s. In Europe, to the contrary, both the 90s, but then even more the 2000s have been the period. And Canada and Australia, relatively less sloped and then steeper in the 90s, but more or less, this is the trend. And even in percentage of the population, Europe and the United States are not very different in terms of how many immigrants there are. Not only this, but large part, fact two, large part of the growth of immigration in rich country is due to immigrants from non-rich country. So there is some internal mobility. Europeans come to the United States, Canadian comes, Europeans go to Australia. But most of the growth of the last 20 years, at least, here I have data only from 1990, come from the fact that people from non-rich country move to the rich part of the world. So the United States increased their percentage of immigrants from non-rich country from 7% to about 11%, Canada and Australia. And in this, the United States is ahead of Europe. In Europe, a lot of that migration that I showed you at the beginning is internal migration, right? So a German or an Italian living in Germany was counted as a migrant in there. But when you take away internal migration, Europe is less. While most of the immigrants in the United States, I showed you the 3 countries of largest migration, Mexico, India, and China, are still considered non-rich countries, so it comes from there. If I have to be precise, most of the immigration does not come from the poorest country in the world. It comes from the middle-income country. People don't migrate from much to the rich country, from Ethiopia or from Sudan. They migrate a lot from Mexico, the Philippines, China, India, which are intermediate, really, income countries. And that has been growing up. But the fact that a lot of migration has come from this poorer country does not mean, and in fact, does not mean in any way that these are big huddled masses to Europe or big number of low-skilled workers. A lot of very educated and highly educated from this country have come to the US and to Europe, in fact. And in fact, if you look again at this graph shows, again, this is EU, US, and Canada all combined, the average of foreign-born, how they have grown. And this is what percentage of foreign-born in the country. The dashed line is what percentage of foreign-born with secondary or less education, and what percentage of foreign-born with more than secondary, so tertiary and more. And the fact that these lines, this is even above the average, or they are close to each other, means that more or less the proportion of college-educated and non-college educated going to Europe is similar to the proportion of the European being there. It's not a mass of less educated. It's a mass which has roughly the same composition in terms of education as the native, and this is the US. The US is slightly different because there is an almost average level of less than high school educated, and then there is above average college and more, and below average only some college education recently. But again, college and more are the group which has the largest representation, the largest percentage inflow as an overall. So immigration is growing from less rich to richer country, and is growing in large part thanks to a lot of educated people who come, and the composition of immigrant is relatively balanced. It's not very different from the one of native. So now let's come to, these are facts, and now let me combine a little bit these facts with some controversies that just go to the core of the economics of it. And I think a good place to start is the big controversy and question is, okay, do immigration, as it has happened in the United States, hurt wages of American work? Now, I think that here, in order to understand why people are so convinced that this is the case, that there is nothing I can do in order to change that, and I know, is that there are 2 true facts from which this starts. And these are facts, and I'm going to show you. But then the connection, I think, is really incorrect. And that's the role of economists to try to communicate. The first fact is that The US have a wage problem, but it's not a problem necessarily of wage of everybody. It's really a problem of the median and the low part of the wage distribution. Wage of college educated have had actually a very healthy and relatively fast growth rate. So it's not a generalized wage problem. It's a wage growth at the medium to the low end of the distribution. So let me show you here one graph that summarizes this. If you take the wage growth over 34 years, okay, and you split American into groups of education, people who know high school degree, some college, bachelor, and more than bachelor, you really see that the top two groups have had an overall growth in real wages. This is growth of real wages over these 30 years. This is about more 30%. So this group almost had a 1% real wage growth per year over this period. And this group had 0.8%. So respectable wage growth every year. The problem is that this group at the bottom of the distribution had actually a relative loss in terms of wages. So this is what, I guess, people will put up. And then they will say, oh, and in this 34 year, at the same time as this happened, also immigrant as a share of the US employed went from 6 to 16, increased. And that's enough to convince some people that immigration is got to be a cause of this fact, which are both true as facts. Even if you just split between college and non-college, the big divide, a lot of people have talked about in the US, the big labor wage divide, college educated have done very well, and non-college educated have done relatively poorly. However, if you really want to be after why that has happened, why this did wage diverged, it's true that US immigrants have grown 10% of the population in this period, but a bunch of other things have also happened in the same period. In particular, computerization and information technology has revolutionized the workplace in a way that many people have found and proved is favorable to college educated, complements them, and substitutes some of the job of the non-college educated. Trade has increased a lot, so a lot of products which were produced here are now imported or outsourced. Manufacturing has been a declining sector dramatically in the US, going from 30% of employment to 18% of employment. Minimum wage has not kept up. So there is just the embarrassment of riches in how many explanations you can try to have for that increased inequality. All these things will tend to increase inequality because minimum wage will help the wage at the bottom end, computerization will help the productivity at the top end, and so on. But I think that a lot of people, have a very simple model in mind. Why did immigration affect wages this way? Well, for immigration to have had an impact on this distribution, what you would need is a lot of immigrants down here that compete with the less educated and few immigrants up here that don't compete. So if you just want a supply, a pure demand supply, as people say, so if you want that immigrant come in and depress these wages because compete for this type of job, but they don't depress this because don't compete for this, you need a distribution of immigrant which has a lot of immigrant here and few here, right? You need to have a reverse type of distribution of immigrant across education group. To the contrary, the distribution of immigrant inflow as a percentage of the group is like this. So the biggest group that had been in percentage affected most by immigration are the group at very high level of education. So in this group, this number means that of the growth between 1980 to 2014, the growth of employment would have been about 35% of the initial level just due to immigration. Immigrants are 35% of the initial employment. While at the low level, the immigration was less, there is a little bit of inversion here, so there are more people with a lower degree than a higher, but this is clearly a positive relationship. And if you crunch the number, here I've crunched the number, I don't want to bring you through the number, but if you really crunch the number in reasonable model of economics, and you put those inflow, what you get actually is the opposite, is that in the college, non-college gap of wages, in explaining the difference between college and non-college, immigration actually would work a little bit in the opposite direction. Because of the many college immigrants that came in, immigrants would have decreased the inequality. So it will increase the non-college relative wages by 0.1, so very little. What really happened is a 24% decrease in the non-college relative wage, and so immigration in the simple model cannot explain any of that change. We'll talk about detail if you want when you ask me questions, but the effect of this simple model is that there is just not enough supply of low-educated to just call it a supply effect. So when you hear people saying this is simple economics, it's just supply and demand, you're going to say, no, this is not simple economics, because if it was just supply and demand, college-educated would have received a stronger effect than that. There are two other models, I think, that people have in mind when they talk about this wage-depressing effect, which are both very wrong, and then I'm going to go to what I think goes closer to be right. And they are very simple, though, so very appealing. One is this, which has been around since the so-called Luddite fallacy, in which people destroyed machines because they thought they took away jobs. And this is that there is a fixed number of jobs. So if an immigrant comes in, there is one more immigrant taking the job, and there is no job for the native anymore. But the truth is that we have centuries of history that show that the number of jobs is roughly proportional to the population of a country. So as population grows, why? Because people not only work, but they also consume. They demand and they supply. And so over time, employment roughly grows at the same rate. The US had a population of 200 million in 1980 at the beginning, and now it's 330, so there are 130 million more people, and the unemployment rate is 5% roughly as it was back then. Employment population rate is actually a little bit higher. Although it went down after the recession, it stays a little down. It's still a little higher than it was in 1980. So this is wrong. That's not how economy works. New people come in, they create demand, they create also supply for the job, but there are more jobs as there are more people. The other is that, but in the short run, if capital, if the number of firms, if the number of machines and firms is fixed, then more people will depress productivity and will create negative effect. The problem here really is that there may be some burst of immigration phases, but most of all, in most cases, immigration is a slow process. Even big migration flows are really relatively slow. If the country that has had the largest migration surge in the last 20 years, believe it or not, is Spain in the 2000s. Spain went from 2% to 15% of immigrants from 2000 to 2010. That's the biggest in percentage immigration growth. Even that raise is about a raise of about 0.4% of the labor force new immigrant every year. It's a small number because just out natural churning, people who retire and people who are in, the labor force changes by this percentage just by aging. In Europe, the labor forces are shrinking more or less at this stage. So every year, firms predict that there is a change and firms plan their investment. Investment respond at the same time as immigration is happening. So I've always criticized this idea that there is a short run and a long run in immigration. No, there is a fact that immigration happens slowly over time, and the firms respond, and most of the margin of response, which is new investment, new building, change in type of jobs, happen at the same time. And so there needs to be no negative short-run effect because a lot of the responses happen at the same time. That was about the general market in the United States, right? But people tell me, nah, it's a fiction. There is no such general market. There are local markets. Local markets where immigrants have really overwhelmed. California, oh my God, there are too many. In some counties have 30, 40% of immigrants. So let's take a look a second at the local labor markets in California. And then, after I've shown you that I think that the local evidence is actually the one to me that suggests that there is more positive effect, in fact, then let's talk about why we don't find a negative effect or why we find positive. So this is just a map, because maps are kind of nice, and this shows with degree of gray how many immigrants, which one are the counties, so these are so-called commuting zone, labor markets, which labor markets has had the largest inflow of immigrants and which one not. Now if you take these 30 years, 40 years actually here in this paper, we do 40 years of immigration, and you just take the growth of immigrants as percentage of the local population, and you plot the growth of immigrants against the growth of wages of natives, okay? Just a correlation. plotting a graph. On the horizontal axis, the more you go to the right, the more you have counties which have received a large inflow of immigrants. So this is Los Angeles in the 90s, in the 2000s, every decade. This is probably one county in California. This means that in one decade, that county received an increase in their labor force by 30%. Huge. 1/3 of the inflow was immigrant. And then plot on the vertical axis the change in percentage of wages of native worker. Okay? If immigrant depress wages, you will want to see a clear negative effect. Where there are more immigrants, these wages are depressed. If immigrant help wages, you see a positive effect. Again, this is a correlation, but the correlation is very clear. Places where more immigrant went are also places where the wage of native grew stronger, faster, more. How about employment of native? Same graph with the inflow of immigrant as percentage of the population and growth in employment of native, still positive, 0, roughly. Did immigrant crowd out, push out native? The answer is that if that was the case, you would have a nice negative relationship. More immigrant, less native job, you have a flat 0, maybe a little positive. So there is not this crowding out. There is not this impact. Now, in this paper, how about if we only focus on native workers who have less than a high school degree? The workers who are unskilled, who we think maybe are more in competition. Maybe all workers don't gain, but let's look at only this and let's plot the wage of those native workers against the inflow of immigrants. Again, a little less strong, but positive relationship. Of course, a lot of this is driven by the fact that some economies grow and they attract everybody. They attract immigrant and native, and they are good with wages. But believe me, I have played long enough with this data, and again, and have tried to parse out what is the causal relationship, controlled for technology, for local boom, constructed some instrument, which are a way economists use to isolate only supply shock. And most of this coefficient is really, this is a table just to illustrate, most of the time this coefficient is positive or non-significant. Essentially, the standard error is larger than the estimate. So the level of the correlation and then all the causal type of analysis that economists do at the local level seem to support the idea that even in the local level, either there is a 0 effect or, if anything, there is a little bit positive effect, maybe on the wages of native. Maybe it's a little stronger for college educated than for non-college educated. So again, if we put together the models, and if you choose the data, and if you try to use the data to get some reasonable estimate, I would say that in aggregate, immigration cannot explain that big increase of income inequality. And even if you use, I use the sort of model which are friendly to me, but even if you use the model of my enemies, at most you can explain, 1/10, 1/9 of that increase. And at the local level, even if you use the model of my enemies, you get a 0 effect, essentially. And there is very little. Okay, so here let me spend a couple of words of why then. So people are like, okay, but we thought we studied in Econ 1 that, there is the downward sloping labor demand, labor supply goes up, wages have to go down. And yeah, but Econ 1 is not everything in life, right? And there is international economics, industrial organization. And so a lot of the reason why immigrants have really a different effect has to do with the fact that the model is too simplistic to capture a lot of things. The first, I think, is that immigrants really do different type of jobs than natives do. So this is something that you hear a lot around. What does it mean, really? It means that they specialize in type of job that Americans are progressively leaving. At the low end of the spectrum, they are more manual, more physical, and these jobs this makes immigrant not the same type of worker, but as economists say, imperfect substitute. So there is a little bit of a complementarity effect. You have a farm worker coming in, they take the job, immigrant coming in, take the job of farm workers, and American native become supervisor, farm salespeople. They take construction job as daily worker, and Americans are pushed into job of construction supervisor. And the complementarity between these two jobs means that more job as worker requires more jobs for more communication-intensive job and supervisor, and that's where a lot of the jobs that Americans take. So immigrants are not the same type of worker as natives, and that's why they don't compete as much. Firm adjust. So there are several papers that show that firms choose technology and techniques which use the best, the type of worker they have. So if they have a lot of manual worker, they will not automatize some parts, and they will let their worker do that. And this does not destroy any job, just adapts and make those jobs productive. More growth of immigrant and more growth of complementary native attracts capital. And a lot of firms internalize this complementarity, need both type of worker, and so for each immigrant, they create a job for an American, or maybe create 0.5 job for an American, but that's enough to offset that competition. And then immigrants create demand, consume. Not only consume, but they consume a variety of goods, and so a lot of papers show that they stimulate the consumption, but also the local variety of production. Who has not appreciated, New York for the fact that you can get any restaurant on the world that you like, from the Romanian to the Basque country? Who has not appreciated in Park, California for the fact that you can find a grocery store of all the type? That's something that increases variety and type of consumption goods, which is valued by people, and so increases aggregate production. But now, in the last part of this talk on facts, I want to spend a couple of minutes on top of all these other effects. I think there is a group which is going to be very important, and on which the immigration policy of the United States are going to affect future growth, which is the high-skilled that come to the United States. So there is a lot of work that shows that the high-skilled that come are really a key contributor to innovation in the United States. 30% of the patents in the US are by foreign-born. We did some work that shows that cities where there is a large inflow of these foreign STEM workers are cities where productivity and wages grow faster. And here, a couple of slides again. If you take only the immigrant with some college education or more, you see that not only they are concentrated among the high and very high level, but they are really concentrated among highly educated in STEM. So what does this mean? It means that among PhD with a STEM job, 33% are immigrant, while in general, only 10% of work to some college educated go to immigrants. So this concentration at the high end of the spectrum is very strong in all dimensions. And as I said, a lot of new growth theory of economists says that these people, the scientists and engineers, are the ones that push productivity. And our quantification was that about the role, the really impact of STEM workers on wages of American workers over 20 years was that thanks to the productivity increases that they generate, wages of American college educated are 5% higher in the last 20 years because of the inflow of that group of STEM. And even the non-college educated gained, but a little less through these productivity changes. Actually, let me show this, which is more impressive, and then. The concentration of foreign-born become larger and larger the higher you go in terms of skills. This is a graph that I show, which is the Nobel laureates. Well, if you have been following Nobel laureates, in this year, US Nobel laureates in the sciences, so I'm keeping economics out, medicine, physics, and chemistry, all Nobel laureates in the United States were foreign-born. Actually, we're all Scottish or British. But over the last 50 years, this is the cumulated number of US Nobel Prizes. And these are the other countries that wins the most: UK, Germany, and France. This dotted line is the number of foreign-born among these immigrants. So the foreign-born Nobel laureates have been overall about 1/4. But if you look at the last 10 years, they've been half of the US Nobel laureate. Of course, very small group, but with a huge impact on science and technology. And this just confirms that this incredible high level of selection of immigrants works. Of course, there is a lot of work that says that also immigrants are not only overrepresented among scientists and engineers, are largely overrepresented among entrepreneurs, the ones who create jobs, create firms. 25% of the business started in the US as of 2015 started by immigrants, when there are only 16% of immigrants, right? So more than that. 20% of the 500 largest corporations in 2014 were headed by immigrants. And in Silicon Valley, of course, which is the cutting edge, more than half that. Another effect that a researcher finds a lot is that companies that hire immigrants, and not only that are founded by immigrants, but they also hire immigrants as workers, increase much more their probability of exporting to the country where these people are from, because they create connection, knowledge, decrease the cost of exporting. So there is a big boost effect in trade from the US from having these people. And then finally, there is this interesting fact that immigrants concentrate in the areas of the United States which are denser. So immigrants tend to be a lot more overrepresented in big metropolitan areas relative to smallish metropolitan areas, relative to non-urban. Los Angeles and New York population is already, as of now, almost half foreign-born. Already now. So these are two cities which are 40%, 43% immigrant. The top 10 metropolitan areas in the United States are 30% foreign-born, but in non-urban area, only 5%. And again, economists, if you follow this, there is a lot of literature that says that big cities are where innovations happen, where technological growth, where agglomeration externality, which are this positive effect of being together of firm, creates higher productivity. So immigrants are contributing more to this agglomeration externality than natives are. Okay. 5 minutes, is that, okay. Okay, so the economics of immigration is, I think, a very, very positive, has a very positive outlook. And even if I'm probably among the person who think that immigration is more key and maybe one of the most enthusiastic proponent of immigration as a way of growth. But even if not me, most of economists will have a very positive view of the potential. Of course, though I would be sort of partial if I didn't recognize some challenges. I think that the challenges, the biggest that I see are, how much immigrants can integrate and assimilate themselves. So far I have talked about the benefit from immigrants essentially to the local economies, but I'm not focused on how easily and how well do they integrate themselves. Of course, a large part of the benefits of migration goes to the migrant himself or herself, right? Because they come from country where wages are low and they come here. But also a lot of the costs are on them. So this is important. Of course, I think that the non-economic aspect of it is very important. Some people consider culture, differences of culture as threatening societies. And so these are something that we need to manage. And an interesting thing that people find also is that, especially in Europe there are very generous redistributive states. So the state taxes the richest to give to the poor much more in many programs. And a lot of research shows that central governments are more willing to do this if you tax rich that look like you and give to poor that look like you. But if you tax rich that look like you and give to poor that don't look like you, people become less willing to vote for redistribution. And I think that that's why in the US maybe some of this immigration works better. There is less of a redistributive states, but this is an important problem to think about. So I will conclude giving some ingredients. I'm not going to go into policies. But if I, again, had to sit with the president, I will provide framework to think about some important ingredients that our planning, even more before policy, our planning about immigration should have. The first is we need the facts to be relevant. And the facts are, I think the facts that I showed you will direct our attention towards some part of immigration and less towards other. And as an economist, I really think that before doing anything, we need to understand some that is going on, and facts are important. The other thing that I think is relevant is that we need to construct immigration policies which, first of all, think of the whole spectrum of immigrants, and I would say the one that work best, generating less probable tension and less unbalances, are policies that include high-skilled and low-skilled immigration. There are many countries that have decided to do essentially to only select high skills. So Canada and Australia are very strong in this point system in which education has a very strong, so they ended up with an immigration system that brings in mostly highly educated, which have all the benefit that I show. But then they find themselves in kind of shortage of some jobs, so they had to do some special visa, for instance, for seasonal worker, agricultural worker, assistance of elderly. Because there are some low-skilled jobs in which there is a huge demand in rich country and not very big supply. So I think a balanced immigration between high skill and low skill is important. Refugees are very important, but we cannot base our immigration policy on those. Those are, I would say, we can afford to be generous with refugees, which are coming from very tough situation, because they are not very many, and they need sort of assistance more than other groups. I would say that if there is one key piece of evidence on both the positive effect of immigrants on the receiving economy and the positive effect on integrating themselves, is their access to labor market. I always say that this is a big difference between Europe and the United States, and the US has got it more right than Europe in this case. Because most of the immigrants in the United States work, as I showed you, even undocumented, even low-educated work at a very high rate. And labor, jobs, is the step number one for the first generation of immigrants to assimilate and to build sort of their future. So in the US, in Europe, when I give this talk, I say more flexible labor market, easier entry of outsiders. And in the US, if I have to say, probably one measure which will have a big impact on this is if the undocumented would find a way to have a legal permit to work, their jobs would improve in quality, probably their wage will go up, and their access to labor market will be facilitated, which I think it will be a net positive in economic terms. This is for the first generation. For the second generation is going to be schooling. Schooling is clearly the way in which the second generation gets integrated, and here, in which upward mobility is promoted. And I would say that it's clear that the first generation of immigrants is willing to sacrifice. Already they have had the huge success of coming in the US. But the second generation feels that they need to fit in, and they need to have a job, they need to be Americans. And again, I think that a lot of the problem in Europe of protest come from the second generation feeling disenfranchised, feeling marginalized because they don't have the same job opportunities. So the challenge is to make sure that the second generation has access and has this key. And there are a lot of issues related to this. So wrapping up, I think that big trend over the last decades, immigration is a very important and slow process. I think it has the potential of being an incredible engine of economic growth. Of course, comes with challenges, but I think employment of immigrants is the key part, is a key component in the success of this. And I think that employment is what makes them contribute to the society, and the fear of negative impact on wages and employment opportunity of natives are massively over-emphasized. And again, I'm sure in the question when you ask me about one specific city, one specific market, you do find specific cases in which maybe immigrants have displaced native, but in the big dynamic of local economy, they have more help than not. And the highly educated are an important engine of growth for the United States, and this new phenomenon of foreign students coming to the US is another potential that the US have to sort of strengthening even more the diversity of its labs, schools, with a very strong and positive effect to the growth in the long run. So I really think that it comes with important challenges which are worth to be faced, because immigration is likely to be a very important force of the next decades, as it has been of the past decades, and we should be prepared, reasonable, and willing to talk about this with anybody who would listen.